Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Name, Image, and Likeness Podcast. My name is Granville Moody Fowler. I am the host of the Name, Image, Likeness Podcast. Today's topic, we're going to talk about more of NIL and the collectives. And to help me do that, I'm going to have my guest, David McGriff, who was on before. As you know him as a sports entertainment and legal expert out of Los Angeles, California. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and bring David in. David, how's it going?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again.
Not a problem. So let's get right into this. The NCAA recently came out with a change as far as the rules to their interim policy. And in that policy, they looked at trying to drop the hammer on the collectives and make them become more accountable for how they interact with the student athletes in the recruiting process. How did we get to this point?
Well, it's an interesting question because when the NCAA allowed NIL, they allowed student athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness back in July 2021, they were kind of hands off on any kind of enforcement or regulations or guidelines implemented to help people understand exactly how those rights should be monetized in accordance with the NCAA. So absent any kind of state laws, the only guidelines that the NCAA implemented was the interim policy. And basically the interim policy said you can't do any kind of pay for play. Any kind of compensation has to be quid pro quo. In other words, the student athlete has to perform some services in exchange for the compensation. They could not induce the student athlete by purposes of an NIL deal, NIL money. So they can't have a student athlete influence their decision on where they go by offering them an NIL deal or the student athlete accepting an NIL deal. And then finally, the fourth thing was that universities couldn't pay the student athlete itself for their name, image, and likeness rights. So those four things were out there as an interim policy, but they really created a void in terms of, first of all, the university couldn't spend money on the student athletes for NIL purposes. But what about a booster? Or what about a third-party organization that was loosely affiliated with the university? There was nothing on that. So that created a void. And like any other new law, there's going to be people that take advantage of loopholes. And in this case, it was collectives. And so collectives started creeping up around the country, established as nonprofit organizations, some for nonprofit, some for profit, with the idea of they're allowing their fan base to engage with athletes and arrange for NIL deals for these student athletes. What happened, though, is that there were other organizations. John Rees in Miami was one of the ones that is kind of getting a lot of the backlash or a lot of the scrutiny in terms of how he's using NIL. And he's saying, look, I'm not running afoul of any laws. There's nothing that says I can't create a collective and have that collective funnel money to athletes that are going to the University of Miami. And he's been very active in doing that. Football, basketball, both men's and women's basketball, and other sports at the University of Miami. And he has been bold in challenging the NCAA or anyone else who wants to say anything about what he's doing and how he's operating his business and saying, if you have a problem, you can come at me. You can try to challenge one of my deals, but, best believe I'm going to stand my ground because I feel that I'm fully in line and complying with any kind of rules regarding NIL.
That there seems to be this power struggle now in NIL with the major colleges. A couple of days ago, you had Nick Saban and Texas A&M.
Jimbo
Fisher, thank you. Going back and forth over who's recruiting students the right way and who's paying for their students. And I think what happened, everybody got caught with their pants down when Texas A&M just actually came out there and was able to utilize NIL to its fullest potential, the way it was intended to be at the time to recruit students.
Right. And Jimbo was his response was really fiery yesterday. Um, Nick Saban's comments came out on Wednesday. Jimbo Fisher fired back yesterday, and then Nick Saban this morning apologized for his original statements. But um, what's interesting about that is that Alabama has done NIL deals as well. They've done quite a few. I think Mr. Saban said it was $25 million in deals that Alabama football has closed. Um, but he was saying that Texas A&M was doing it somehow. Their deals were running afoul of the spirit of the NIL law, because there really wasn't in any particular NIL laws prior to May 9th that would govern collectives, NIL collectives, and how they operate. So really, it seemed to me that Nick Saban was kind of just kind of yelling at clouds and really making a he was trying to make a point that really wasn't valid, in my opinion. I think he was upset because Alabama wasn't ranked number one in terms of their recruiting this year. Usually they're the number one recruiting class, and this time Texas A&M took that spot. And so Nick Saban had to explain it away some kind of way. He says, well, they had to be cheating. It has to be, taking advantage of the NIL collectives laws that aren't really being enforced. And speaking of those laws, I mean, so on May 9th, the NCAA finally did introduce some guidelines, and it was kind of built up as this big announcement. But in my opinion, it fell flat, because all it seemed to do really is say that the NCAA was going to treat NIL collectives just like boosters, and that they could run afoul of NCAA inducement rules the same as boosters can. And so what it says specifically is that NIL collectives cannot participate in meeting with prospective NIL student athletes, or they can't meet with prospective student athletes in terms of offering them an NIL deal for a recruiting purpose. And so the question is, what exactly is a recruiting purpose? Is them just offering a deal to a prospective student and saying, hey, this is available over here? Is that considered a recruiting purpose? I think that language is going to be litigated in courts for years if the NCAA actually decides to enforce that, because that's one of the other questions. So they made their policy, right? They have their guidelines as of May 9, and they said, we're going to enforce this. That's what they said. Now we know that they have a limited enforcement division. They've already complained about them not being able to enforce all the rules that they would like to. So you would think, okay, so since they can't enforce strongly across the board, they're probably going to pick and choose a couple of the so-called bad actors in the NIL marketplace and use them as kind of a sacrificial lamb or guinea pig to test their performance in enforcing these rules. So if they decide to do that, I think that the NIL collective, one of their main things is going to be, nothing that we're doing is an inducement. Nothing that we're doing qualifies as a recruiting purpose. And they can make that argument with a straight face because there's very little detail in the NCAA rules as to what constitutes a recruiting purpose.
That you actually answered the question I was going to ask to start with. What is your legal understanding of a collective? Like, I'm still trying to understand, when does the collective actually get to interact with that student athlete to offer them an NIL deal?
So you asked a couple of questions. First question is, what is an NIL collective? It's an organization that is organized alongside a university, and let's say University of Miami. I don't recall the name of their collective at this time, but let's just call it Hurricane Collective, right? That's their mascot. That collective is organized as, like I said, either a nonprofit or for-profit corporation, and they take in donations from their fan base, and they are able to accumulate funds combine funds as a opportunity to offer these NIL deals to particular student athletes that are enrolled in the University of Miami. That's all fine. The question becomes now, okay, you have this 5-star who's coming out of high school in Florida, and you want that quarterback to play at University of Miami. So does the Hurricane Collective go to that young man and say, we have $1 million in NIL deals that we can guarantee your first year? Would that constitute a recruiting purpose? I don't know the answer to that. And it sounds like, just discussing it, it sounds like that does sound kind of shady. But does it actually qualify as a recruiting purpose under the NCAA rules? That's the question that's going to be, I think, litigated in the future.
At some point in time, the NCAA is going to have to come up with an ironclad definition of what NIL is and how it can be used, because right now it's the Wild Wild West. I mean, you have some schools that are poaching student athletes from their school and enticing them to come to the portal and transfer to their school, and then they're getting an NIL deal, like the young lad from, I think it was Penn State. Receiver went to USC.
Pitt, yeah, Jordan
Pitt.
Addison.
Yeah.
He was his University of Pitt student athlete, yes.
Mm-hmm. And so it puts schools that were already, to me, at a disadvantage against the big schools at a further disadvantage, because now they've gone and they've offered these kids scholarships to their programs where nobody was going to, we won't say nobody was going to offer them, but they weren't high priorities. And then the kids have been grown and groomed and have produced and shown that they're capable of playing. And now USC says, hey, we're going to go ahead and pick this kid up now because we want him on our team because we know he can ball out.
Right.
So how?
And USC is one of the schools that has a lot of money. So you could say that they have an advantage there.
Okay. You as a parent, I don't know many of our guests, our viewers know this, but you have a young man that's getting ready to go off into play basketball at Duquesne. Yes, Duquesne. Yeah. And as you as a parent, how do you see the NIL deal working for you, or for him at least?
Well, I think it's a good opportunity for him, not only to put a little money in his pocket, but more importantly for me, which is an aspect of NIL that's not really discussed a lot, but it's an opportunity for him to understand how he can monetize his value on social media in general. And learning that lesson early on, it allows him to learn about valuation, learn about monetization, and also just the bare basic finances of earning money, saving money, and investing money. And those are kind of things that a lot of college students are not introduced to. The idea of the value of something that's not tangible, right? So what he's looking at, because he has a growing Instagram following, he's looking at how his value is increasing as his followers grow, as his platform's bigger, as he's gone from a junior college athlete to a Division I athlete. So that's kind of what I've been seeing with him and advising him and counseling him along the way.
Now, are you going to be advising and counseling him as a parent, or are you going to be part of his legal team?
Both. Both. I mean, no one's going to protect him like I will.
That's a true statement. Speaking of protection, there's a young lad in University of Miami who has an agent, which I had up for a second. Maybe you can help me out with that. The agent's name, if you remember it.
I don't remember the
Miami basketball.
I don't remember the agent's name. The player's name is Isaiah Wong, and the agent made an announcement that unless the University of Miami offered him more money, he was going to enter the transfer portal. So this combination of the NIL and the transfer portal has caused a lot of people to say that there's free agency has been introduced into college sports. I wouldn't actually go that far, but there is student athlete empowerment. And frankly, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that college athletics over time is going to be stronger because of NIL and the transfer portal. I think it gives student athletes a little more say over their college career. And again, there isn't anything wrong with that. Coaches leave all the time. You can be recruited by a coach for a period of time, for a year, commit to that coach, and then the coach either gets fired or he or she leaves and goes to another university, and now you have to deal with a whole new team of coaches. That's not fair to the student athlete. So having the student athlete, giving the student athlete the ability to transfer to another school, I think is a good thing ultimately. The problem with Isaiah Wong is that he received a lot of backlash for his agent and making that announcement, issuing basically an ultimatum to the University of Miami. And as a result, Mr. Wong actually wound up firing his agent a few days later. And I think with that, the lesson there is it shows that student athletes really have to be very careful about the people that they bring on as advisors and representatives, because their representative can set a narrative for them in the public marketplace that they may not even necessarily agree with or feel ultimately themselves. But because their agent or their lawyer or a family member, whomever is speaking for them, now that's the narrative that's created around them because of what's said, and it's not even coming out of the student's mouth.
That's an unfortunate incident for the young man. As a legal representative, what is it that a student athlete should do as far as looking into the background of either an agent or their legal representative?
The best thing, if you're able to talk to someone who has been represented by that person, that is usually the best method to understand how that person operates, and you can have firsthand experience of how they dealt with their agent or their lawyer or their counsel, and you can get the good and the bad from that person. The other thing I think from a basic standpoint is that if a person is holding themselves out to a student athlete as a lawyer or an agent, they should independently confirm that that person is a lawyer or an agent. I read an article that in the NFL, I can't remember the exact numbers, but of all the prospective players that were trying to get drafted in this latest NFL draft who had listed their agents, there was a substantial percentage of players who listed people as their agent who actually were not NFL agents. So they were just relying on the person's word. Yeah, I'm an NFL agent. I can represent you. And it turns out that they weren't even agents. So I think student athletes should be careful about first just independently verifying that the person is who he or she says they are. And then the other thing is trying to find out how that person operates and if their clients, their former clients and their current clients are actually happy with their service.
Okay. Let's talk about Nazir Cunningham. The young man signed with Overtime Basketball Association, and he's able to play basketball in a semi-pro league, I guess you could call it, and still maintain his college eligibility. You see that as a good thing?
I do. So Overtime Elite started a couple of years ago. This may be the third season, second or third season. And the idea between Overtime Elite was to give high-profile high school basketball players a forum to play in front of crowds. They could play on a streaming service, and they could get paid. And so those folks were on a level to which they didn't really worry. They weren't worried about playing in college. They were going to play in the G League or they're going to play overseas. But now what Nasir did is he decided not to take a salary from Overtime Elite, but instead be compensated through NIL deals. And he immediately signed a trading card deal right after he made the announcement that he was signing with Overtime. And so he was able to earn money there. But and at the same time, he's able to maintain his college eligibility. So it gives him options. After he finishes with Overtime Elite, now he can go to Kentucky or Duke or Kansas or one of these high-profile D1 schools if he chooses to, or he can just go to the G League and go to the NBA from there.
So NIL, it's not, I mean, we associate it with college, but I guess him signing with Overtime Elite, you can also apply it towards other programs or institutions that will allow you to use your name, image, likeness.
Right, because Mr. Cunningham is still high school age, and in high school in New Jersey, you can sign an NIL deal. The same thing you can do in California. In California, actually, Nike just did their first high school NIL deals with two women who play at Harvard Westlake here in Los Angeles. They play soccer, and they're both committed to play at Stanford. At least one of their names is Alyssa and Giselle Thompson, and at least one of them plays for the national women's team. Either one or both. I'm not exactly sure, but one is a junior and one is a high schooler. One is a sophomore at Harvard Westlake. And Nike gave them an NIL deal because in California, high schoolers can sign NIL deals.
That's good. And that's going to become the next battlegrounds for all the states to be able to acquire NIL deals for high school students.
Absolutely. I represent an agency that he's an NIL agent, and he's actively looking for deals for his high schoolers, any high school clients that he signs.
All right. Well, thank you for coming back on and clearing up some of the stuff about the NIL and the new changes that are coming down the line. We'll look forward to having you back on again.
Absolutely.
And good luck to your son, and I wish the best for him.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, All right.